Before we begin talking specifically about human development in the prenatal stage, we're going to lay some foundations for influences that broadly impact the course of our development. In this lecture, I'll be discussing biological and environmental foundations upon which human development is built. More specifically, I'll begin by talking about biological, or we'll focus on genetic foundations of development. We'll move on and talk about environmental context and environmental factors that influence the course of human development. And then we'll wrap up by talking about interactions between those biological and environmental influences on our development. Hopefully most of this is review, so I'm going to go fairly quickly. If you have questions about some of the basics of genetics, please send an email so that I can help with your questions. You probably learned sometime much earlier in your education that chromosomes store and transmit genetic information. On those chromosomes, we have genes that are segments of DNA that contain the specific information upon which organisms are built. DNA is the substance of which genes and chromosomes are made. When we talk about the genetic makeup of organisms, we frequently discuss genotype and phenotype. An individual's genotype is their specific genetic makeup. Based upon the Human Genome Project, scientists estimate that human beings have somewhere around 20 to 25,000 genes. Now, since the Human Genome Project was completed, that estimate has changed a few times. So early on, I think it was about 30,000 genes. Most recently, just a little bit more than 19,000 genes. But that's a good range. Let's say 20 to 25,000 genes. And those genes are the building blocks that make up a human being. If you look at the overall information contained in our chromosomes, we're about 99 to 99.9% similar in our genetic makeup. Now, for a geneticist, the difference between 99 and 99.9% is a big deal. For the purposes of this class, I want to emphasize the fact that what we know about genetics tells us that all humans are fairly similar in their genetic makeup. Another way to look at that is to say that all of the variability that we see between individual humans that is based in genetics occurs from a very small amount of genetic variability between those organisms. What we can see is that very small changes in genes can produce very significant changes in organisms. To highlight that a little bit further, humans have somewhere between 96 and 98% genetic similarity with apes, and about 63% genetic similarity with rats. Obviously, humans and rats and humans and apes are very, very different, but we share a lot of our genetic makeup. Once again, this returns us to the principle that very small changes in genetics can produce very large changes in organisms. The genetic makeup of an individual is not always reflected in the observable characteristics that we see in that individual. Those observable characteristics are called a phenotype. The phenotype is the observable characteristics that we see in an individual. There are many cases where an individual may carry a certain gene, but we do not see the effects of that gene. Perhaps because there's some environmental factor that is required to activate the gene, and the individual has not encountered that environmental factor, or because the gene is recessive and the individual also carries a dominant gene, which hides the recessive gene. So we make a distinction between an individual's actual genetic makeup and the traits that we can observe in that individual. The genetic makeup, again, is called the genotype. The traits that we observe, those are called the phenotype. To make that really easy to understand, think about identical twins. Identical twins share 100% of their genes, but obviously, identical twins are not 100% similar. Why? Because the development of each individual, each twin, is influenced by the environment. That brings us to even more variability. So we know that small genetic changes can produce lots of variability, and we know that the environment can produce lots of variability. Thus, we should not be surprised that when we look at humans, we see lots of variability for the kinds of traits that we would be interested in when we study human development. I've mentioned the fact that, for example, some genes have a dominant form and a recessive form. When a gene has more than one form, we call those forms alleles. Alleles will appear at the same place on a chromosome in the pair of chromosomes. And I'm sure you recall that we get one from our mother and one from our father. When an individual has two alleles that are alike, we say that that individual is homozygous for that genetic trait. When an individual has alleles that differ, we call that person heterozygous. Alleles typically compete for expression. Sometimes one is dominant and the other is recessive, such that if the person has one copy of each, we only see the action of the dominant allele. Other times, and we'll discuss this more later, the two alleles may lead to some kind of intermediate or combined trait. Again, we'll return to that later. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on simple dominant recessive inheritance. Once again, I hope this is a review, but I want to use this to illustrate some of the basics of genetics. When offspring inherit two different alleles, that is, they are heterozygous, only one will affect the child's characteristics, that is the phenotype, when we are talking about a trait that is based upon simple dominant recessive inheritance. So let's imagine, for our example, hair. Some hair is curly and some hair is straight. For the purposes of our example, we will assume that curly hair is the dominant trait and straight hair is the recessive trait. We'll have an allele for each. In this case, we have what are called Punnett squares. Once again, you've probably learned these in the past, and this is intended to be a review. We would not necessarily know an individual's genotype, that is the actual genes they have, if that individual has the dominant trait in question. In this case, curly hair. An individual with curly hair, that's the phenotype, could be either heterozygous, that is, they could have one straight and one curly gene, or they could be homozygous dominant, two copies of the curly gene. Now, for a trait that's based upon simple dominant recessive inheritance, we will know an individual's genotype if we observe the recessive trait. That is, assuming that hair, curly versus straight, is based upon simple dominant recessive inheritance, if we observe an individual who has naturally straight hair, we would know immediately that that individual is homozygous recessive, or we could say that they have two copies of the straight hair gene. We're going to use these Punnett squares to look at how parents and their genetic makeup result in offspring. So, let's begin with Frank and Susie. Frank has curly hair, and Frank's genotype is heterozygous. He has one copy of the curly gene, one copy of the straight gene. In this case, the curly gene will be represented by an uppercase C, and the straight gene is represented by a lowercase c. Susie has straight hair. We know that she must be homozygous recessive. That is, she has 2 copies of the straight gene. If Frank and Susie have offspring, we can take their genotypes and put them into a Punnett square, and we can see how their genes can combine. That is, a child can get a curly gene from Frank and a straight gene from Susie, or a child can get a straight gene from Frank and a straight gene from Susie. Here in our Punnett square, we see the possible outcomes for both genotype and phenotype. Frank and Susie, as shown here, could have children who are heterozygous or homozygous recessive. Those are the genotypes. Or we could also say they can have children with either curly or straight hair. Those are the phenotypes. I want to point out that the information in a Punnett square is statistical in nature. That is, it tells you a likelihood. If Frank and Susie were to have 4 children, there's no guarantee that half of the children will have curly hair and half will have straight hair. This is a statistical likelihood. The most likely outcome, if Frank and Susie have 4 children, is that those children, half of them, will have curly hair and half will have straight hair. However, it is entirely possible that Frank and Susie could have 4 children with straight hair and 4 children with curly hair. Each child's genotype will be the result of probabilistic genetic inheritance independent of their siblings. Some people, like Frank and Susie, will have 4 children with curly hair if they had 4 children. Some, like Frank and Susie, could have 3 curly and 1 straight, 2 of each, 3 straight, 1 curly, or 4 children with straight hair. All of those are possible outcomes. Again, the most likely outcome being what's shown in the Punnett square. Let's imagine that instead of having children with Susie, Frank has children with Paula. Paula has curly hair, and we happen to know that Paula's genotype is homozygous dominant. Once again, you can see the possibilities for Frank and Paula's children. That is, each child will get a curly gene from Paula. Some children will get a curly gene from Frank, and the others a straight gene from Frank. In this case, you can see that all in Frank of Paula's children will have curly hair, and that is accurate. Frank and Paula can only have children with curly hair. However, not all of their children will have the same genotype. So all of their children have the curly hair phenotype, but some of their children will be homozygous dominant and other children will be heterozygous. So that's an easy example of basic dominant recessive inheritance. Notice that we can have 2 individuals that have the same phenotype. In this case, Frank Jr. and Pauline both have curly hair. However, they have different genotypes. Frank Jr. is heterozygous, thus displaying the dominant trait. Pauline is homozygous dominant, also displaying the dominant trait. We would also call Frank a carrier for straight hair, as is Frank Jr. That is, while we see the dominant phenotype, they also carry the recessive gene. I mentioned twins earlier, and I just want to point out that some twins, and you probably know this, are called fraternal or dizygotic. That is, there are 2 zygotes or fertilized ova, and those twins have the same genetic similarity as any other siblings. That is, statistically, they share 50% of their genes. Other twins are what we call identical are monozygotic twins. That is, there is one zygote that divides into two individuals. Those twins share 100% of their genetic material. I'll remind you, as I said earlier, that even monozygotic twins are not 100% similar in all of their traits. If every trait was determined by simple dominant recessive inheritance, then identical twins would in fact be completely and totally identical in terms of their phenotypes. However, there are many traits that are not the result of simple dominant recessive inheritance. They may be the result of more complicated forms of inheritance, which I'll cover in just a moment, and they may also depend upon experiences in the environment. It is because of these other influences or other types of genetic inheritance that identical twins, while they share their DNA, differ in their phenotypes for some traits. Some traits are based upon incomplete dominance, which I mentioned earlier. In this case, we can have two or more alleles of a single gene, so that is, the same position on a chromosome, but those alleles result in some combined trait. Now, typically I don't like to mislead students, but in the example of our dominant recessive inheritance, I did because this will be familiar to you. So whether or not you have curly or straight hair is not actually based upon simple dominant recessive inheritance. I simplified it for the example. Okay. It's actually a form of incomplete dominance. That is, individuals who get a curly and a straight gene will have wavy hair, an intermediate trait between the two. There are some traits that are based upon simple dominant recessive inheritance. For example, some of you have earlobes, and some of you have ears that are attached to your head at the bottom. Whether or not you have earlobes is based upon simple dominant recessive inheritance. There's not an intermediate trait. Other things, for example, whether or not you can roll your tongue into a circle is based upon simple dominant recessive inheritance. If you can, then you carry the dominant gene, and if you can't do that, then you're homozygous recessive. Those are a couple of easy examples. For the most part, we're not very interested in this class in traits that are simply the product of simple dominant recessive inheritance. And in fact, most of the things that we're interested in are also not the result of incomplete dominance. Most of the traits that we are interested in this class tend to be the product of what's called polygenetic inheritance. Polygenetic inheritance is a type of genetic inheritance in which many genes combine to influence a trait. Scientists believe that some 20 genes come together to influence our eye color. You see there on the screen 16 distinct eye colors. You may notice immediately that there are 17 eyes on the screen. 2 are the same. I'll let you find those 2. All of the others are distinct eye colors. So for example, we tend to think that eyes come in blue and brown, and perhaps sometimes people say hazel. In reality, eye color is far more complicated. In my house, there are 4 individuals with blue eyes, myself, my wife, and both of my children. And yet none of us have the same color of eyes. We each have a different color of blue. Eye color is, as I said, the product of many genes that come together. Scientists think a little over 20 genes. Other things that are the product of polygenetic inheritance are things like height, skin color, and then things much more interesting to us like intelligence. Okay. In addition to polygenetic inheritance, many of these traits are not simply the product of our genetics. Let me pull out height. Height is not only a product of genetics, it's also a product of your environment. We'll discuss it more later, but at this point, I'll just point out that your height is influenced by your genetics. This is why tall people tend to have tall children, average people tend to have average children, and people below average tend to have children who are also below average in height. But there is considerable variability, and your height is also influenced by things like your nutrition. That's an environmental influence. Almost everything that we are interested in this class will be the product of both polygenetic inheritance and environmental influences. I'll just point out real quick that there are some human traits that are the product of chromosomal abnormalities. So not just an abnormality in a particular gene, but an abnormality that is based upon an entire chromosome. Probably everybody in here has heard of Down syndrome. And Down syndrome is the result of issues with the 21st chromosome, in this case having 3 instead of 2 copies. Another example that you might have heard of or might not of chromosomal abnormality is something called Williams syndrome. There are also chromosomal abnormalities that are related to the sex chromosomes. For example, some individuals, instead of being the more typical XX or XY, XX being female, XY being male, there are some individuals who are XXY, XYY, and so forth. In this class, we will not have time to explore how these chromosomal abnormalities influence human development. But I do want to mention early in the semester that when those things occur, they do have a very significant influence on the course of human development. So let's transition and talk about environmental influences on our development. Now remember, we defined context earlier this semester, and the context includes both genetic or biological and environmental factors. For the next few slides, we're going to specifically think about some of those environmental influences on our development. In this slide, I'm just trying to capture the fact that human beings can experience an immense variety of environmental context. It's probably very easy for you to conceptualize of how different it might be, for example, growing up in a small town, growing up in a major city, growing up in a very rural agricultural community, or growing up in a very impoverished third world nation. And it probably is very intuitive for you to realize that those different environments are going to have a significant impact on the course of our development. So again, I'm just calling your attention to the very wide range of environmental context that humans can experience and that have an influence on our development. Specifically, over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the family, socioeconomic status and family functioning, affluence, poverty, neighborhoods, towns, and cities, and wider cultural contexts. Let's begin with the family. It's important to point out that the influences within a family are bidirectional, and that the family is a system. It's very intuitive for us to think of parents as influencing the development of their children. And in fact, we frequently think about the ways that parents influence the development of their children. However, it's also vital that we recognize that children are influencing the development of their parents. I'll use myself as an example. I have 2 children. I have a teenager and a young child. There is no doubt at all that having these children has influenced the course of my development. If I did not have any children, I might be a significantly different person than the person that I am today. Thus, I, as a parent, have influence over my children's course of development, but those children are also influencing the course of my development. That is why we say that the family influences are bidirectional. We can conceptualize those influences being either direct or indirect. Direct influences within the family system are two-person relationships. That is, for example, parent-child relationships. My relationship with my oldest child, his relationship with me. I have a direct influence on him, and he has a direct influence on me. Obviously, our family, as I've already described, has other members. So another direct influence would be my wife and myself. I have an influence on my wife's development, and my wife has an influence on my development. The family system is frequently a complicated system. And in thinking about how the family system influences our development, we can also conceptualize indirect influences on the development of an individual. For example, my marriage has an influence on the way that I relate to my child. Now, this is just an example. I'm not saying I would actually do this, but I think this will illustrate a good example, easy example. So let's imagine that my older child came to me and said, "Dad, I think it would be really awesome to put a swimming pool on the side of the house and jump off the roof into the pool." And let's imagine that I'm a somewhat adventurous parent, and I think that sounds fun. I might be inclined to say, "Sure, that's awesome, let's try it." Let's also imagine that I'm married to a woman who is somewhat more conservative and less adventurous. And as I consider the child's proposal, I realize that if I allow my child to jump off the roof into the swimming pool, it may endanger the health of my marriage. And so, even though it might be my inclination to say yes, I may say no in order to ensure the well-being of my marriage. Thus, we would say that the marriage itself is having an influence on my relationship with my child. That is an indirect family influence. Now, it's certainly the case that my relationship with a child could have an influence on my marriage. Again, these are bi-directional. So it could go the other direction as well. When we look at family systems and we think about these indirect influences, one of the things that we frequently see is that when couples have a good, healthy marriage, those couples often parent together. We call that co-parenting, mutual support of each other as parents. As you might imagine, sometimes when the marriage is not as healthy, we don't see co-parenting. We may see one parent taking primary responsibility for the children and little involvement by the other parent, or we may see considerable conflicts in how the parents individually relate to their children. which may then feed back into the marriage and create considerable marital conflict. One of the things that we frequently consider when we think about the family system is the influence of things like a marriage on children. Frequently, we see children internalize the difficulties that we see in their parents' marriage. That is, if the parents are fighting a lot, the child may believe that it is his or her fault. One of the reasons that seems to be the case is that parents frequently fight over their children and differences in how they feel they should raise their children. When the child sees a lot of conflict between their parents, particularly if the child is at the center of that conflict, the child can feel as if they are at fault, and they internalize that difficulty. The other thing that we sometimes see is children externalizing difficulties within the family system. That is, the child may see their parents hit each other, which obviously is unacceptable, or they may hear their parents call each other names. The child then goes to school, has a mild conflict with somebody, but models those behaviors they're seeing at home, or that is, we see externally the things that are happening in their home. That's called externalizing difficulties. Those are kinds of things that sometimes developmental scientists and obviously, for example, therapists or counselors might look for when they're looking into the well-being of children and they're considering the family influences. One of the most significant things to consider about families as we think about human development is the fact that families change a lot. There are many changes that impact families from both within and outside the family. Some easy examples. A person may change their job duties at work, and those changes in the job duties may influence their availability in the home and thus have an impact on the family. Within the families, we have births and deaths and marriages, and those kinds of things have very significant effects on family structures and the well-being within families. The necessity to adapt to change means that families can sometimes be stressful and sources of stress, but they can also be immense sources of support. Throughout the semester, we'll consider socioeconomic status and relationships between our socioeconomic status and the course of human development. It's probably obvious to you that we have to be very careful about talking about causes and effects or using that sort of causal language, because when we study socioeconomic status, we really can't do that experimentally. That is, we can't really assign people into, for example, a high or low socioeconomic status group. Instead, we have to look at those groups that are pre-existing or the groups that people are already a part of. So when we talk about socioeconomic status throughout the semester, try to keep in mind that we're talking about associations. If you're not familiar with the term socioeconomic status, I'll point out that it combines years of education, job prestige and skill, and income. You probably already know that there are some kinds of jobs that have lots of prestige and require lots of education, and they tend to be well respected. Whereas there are other types of jobs or careers that require little skill or little education, and they tend to be less well respected. Likewise, you know that there is a widespread of income and income potential for different kinds of jobs. When we look at families, we can categorize families into different socioeconomic status groups. You'll notice here that we have high and low. Hopefully, it immediately occurs to you that there's a group that's missing. That's everybody in the middle. Okay, so when we look at high and low, we're looking at two ends of the spectrum, and please keep in mind that there are many people who are in the middle. When we compare the two ends of the spectrum, that is higher socioeconomic status to lower socioeconomic status families, we do tend to see some associations or systematic differences in the kinds of values in those families. That is, if we ask people, what are the things that are most important to you, we tend to get some different answers. I'm not going to go through the entire table. I'm going to suggest that you pause the video at this point, read the table. These are straightforward. Instead, what I want to point out is that these are tendencies. There's no guarantee, for example, that a high SES family will have a high priority on providing their children with warmth, explanations, and verbal praise. That is something that tends to be more common. But to know what's going on in an individual family, we'd have to look at the individual family. In the same way, we can't assume that because a family is a lower socioeconomic status family, that they place a high priority on neatness. We can make a guess that that's likely, but to know what's happening in an individual family, we would need to look at that individual family. There is no doubt that there are some advantages to being part of a higher socioeconomic status group. Many of those advantages are financial in nature. I don't want you to assume that children from high SES families are necessarily and always better off from low SES families and vice versa. Once again, to know what's going on in a particular family, we need to look at that particular family. There are some differences that we tend to observe beyond those covered in the last table. So when we compare higher and lower SES families, we tend to see a difference in the timing and duration of the family life cycle. That is, people from higher socioeconomic status families tend to marry later, they tend to have children later, and they tend to live longer. When we look at higher SES families, we tend to see that they have a higher level of education. That's probably a given, considering that education is part of SES. But we also tend to see that women are more well respected, or more likely to be treated as equals to men in higher SES families. We also see some advantages for children's cognitive development. That is, children from higher SES families tend to have some better outcomes on cognitive development than children from lower SES families. I want to be very clear and say we don't really think that's because of any biological differences. Instead, we think that those are environmental. That is, that the children from higher SES families have greater access to materials and resources. Their parents may spend more time trying to emphasize the development of those abilities. So, for example, doing things like reading to their children and so forth. Now, again, I want to emphasize these are only tendencies, and to know what's happening with any family, we have to look at that particular family.